Hello, Royalers. It's Lady T, and welcome to another episode of Royal Black in Elite. And this episode is by popular demand. Last week, I did a video on a woman named Queen Philippa Hinault, and we talked about her African heritage and all about her life. And something that came out of it was her son, Edward the Black Prince. Now, people were very interested to learn more about him. I mean, who is this Black Prince, this knight no one ever talks about, or we didn't learn in Black history? So I want to fulfill my viewers' request, and I hope that you enjoy it. Now, of course, this is Lady T. I'm a social historian and lecturer. And I want to thank you for joining me for another great episode of Royal Black and Elite as we travel to England to learn more about the African presence within the English monarchy and European royalty. And so again, we want to introduce you today to Edward the Black Prince. He was one of England's greatest military leaders, and he was also a knight. Most importantly, he was the son of a king. His father was Edward III, and he went on to rule alongside with his wife, Queen Philippa of Hainault, for 40 years. And so this is where the discussion about where does this name, the Black Prince, come from? And so if you were tuned in to my Queen Philippa Hainault video, you'll know everything about this. And if you haven't had an opportunity to watch it, be sure to go back over and watch and learn about her African heritage. Now, in our series on Blacks in royalty, we are discovering royals around the world, and in this case, Europe, they had African heritage. And Edward, he was no different. The greatest debate surrounding why they called him the Black Prince came from historians, some saying it was because of his black armor. But what we will see, his armor is not black. John Seedspit also reported in 1611 that the King of France said it was because of his black deeds in France. And in 1642, Thomas Fuller, who was a historian, also stated it was because of his deeds and not because of his complexion. Which in lies the problem. Mr. Fuller, why even bring up his complexion? Because indeed, it was that very complexion that got him the name Edward the Black Prince. Now, they also called him Moor, and so that means he was a darker skinned person, and we know that the Moors inhabited his mother's hometown or Lower France at the time. Be sure to look at that story because it will help you understand why his complexion was of great importance, and just like his mother's complexion, which they said she was brown all over. So the debate as to why they call him the Black Prince is, I believe, is related to his skin tone. And I'm not saying he was dark skinned because the African ancestry was a few generations removed. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that he was dark enough for them to call him the Black Prince. So now that we've covered that, let's get into his story because it is very fascinating. A knight. Wow. Listen, he was born on June the 15th, 1330. And he was the first of 15 children. So his parents, first of 15 kids. Boy, they had a lot of kids back in those days. And he really began his early career, his military career very early in his life because his father was into a battle with France and something called the 100-Year War. And so, of course, as a son, he was going to be expected to fight. And fight he did, but not before being bestowed many honors. First, at only 7 years old, he was made Duke of Cornwall. And the next year, he was named Guardian of the Kingdom. The next two subsequent years, 1340 and 42, he held the same title. Now, in 1343, he became the Prince of Wales. And you may have heard William being called the Prince of Wales. So this is his relative. And at only 16, he was knighted. Now, there were many titles between each of these. I mean, I couldn't list them all. He was a well-decorated sovereign. So where he got his reputation for being a fierce warrior is during this 100-year war. And he won a war called the Battle of Crécy and the one called Poitiers, which he won in 1356 in France. France could not stand Edward because he came through and beat the socks off of them. So much so that the king, John II at the time, who was the king of France, he actually gave him some territory in a place called Aquitaine. Now look at this place. Isn't it beautiful? And it actually, they're saying that it's the most beautiful place to live in France. It's really still just like the ancient times. And so if you ever visit France, make sure you take a stop in Aquitaine because it is beautiful. And this is where Edward ruled after his many, victories in battle. Now, Edward wasn't only fighting. He also got married during this time. His wife, her name is Joan, and she was from Aquitaine as well. So he did get married, and she had some children. She was actually divorced and widowed. So they were married in October of 1361. So here we have his wife, his family living in the place that he had conquered. So you can imagine the people didn't like him very much. In fact, the bishops and the local French loyalists were even hostile. He was taxing them to the hilt, and they revolted. They did not like it. He had a very extravagant court. He was spending all these people money, and he even had a coin minted, and the people had had enough. Even though Edward was the son of a royal, he was a wonderful fighter and conqueror. His biographer, Sir John Chandos, he said that Edward was horrible with money. He reportedly spent his time jousting, hunting, and gaming, and he loved jewels. In fact, his ruby is called the Black Prince Ruby, is a part of the imperial state crown. Look at this, isn't this beautiful? So he had great taste, but he had his taste on other people's money, and they were not having it. So at only 41 years old in 1371, he had to relinquish his land back to King Edward III, his father. So he had to go back home because he could no longer rule the people because they were no longer wanting to be ruled. They were tired of him spending all their money. And Edward, he really didn't want to go back to England. In fact, he didn't like losing anything. So to lose a whole territory that he had fought for was really rough on him. But when he returned, they said he was already sick. It was reported that, they didn't know really what he passed away from. In fact, some said dysentery, some said old war wounds, and it was even rumored that he had cancer. Now, his wife, she preceded him in death. And she was buried next to her ex-husband. And unfortunately, because Edward didn't remarry and he died so young, he was buried next to his wife, or wife who had already passed away. Edward died at only 45 years old on June the 8th, 1376. And he left explicit instructions about how he wanted to be buried and where he wanted to be buried. But he was most known and remembered for all of his insignia, his coat of arms, the shield of peace, his signet ring, and even his gauntlets, which were his, gloves for his hand. So there's a lot of, history left behind from Edward. And if you go to, Paris, to England, you can see some of these things. And I just wanted to let you see some of them here. And of course, this is his tomb. So just like all of the rest of the pictures that we've been seeing on the other videos, they have very elaborate tombs for the kings of the time. And so here's Edward. And here he is laying in effigy, just like so many of the other pictures that I showed from the other kings and sovereigns and their wives. They lay in effigy. And I also wanted to stop right back by real quickly to the shield. So you see here, he didn't get the name Black Prince from this because there's no black anywhere on this. Edward, I tell you, what a great story. A knight, a would-be king, and known as the Black Prince. But he never took the throne. In fact, his son, Richard II, did. And as we look at Richard, or this depiction of Richard II, we see those African Moorish roots coming through again. I mean, his features are very distinct. And so, you all, I just tell you these stories because we are a part of royal history. And it's important that we know it and that we tell these stories. Now, my sources for today's episode was Thomas D. Mowbray's First Duke of Norfolk, also blackpast.com, and the writings of historian Jean Frizart. I can't thank you enough for joining me. I hope you enjoyed this episode. And as always, thank you all for liking, sharing, and subscribing. We are still growing, and it's because of you. Don't forget to hit that like button and come back and see me for another great episode of Royal Black and Elite.